test.
Still, all right.
Where is
Who?
Ian?
Probably in the bathroom. Do I have to do, when I do the roll call, do I have to do the reps too?
No.
All right, good.
No, they're not part of the official.
All right.
Hi, Rick. Sorry I delayed you.
Yeah, no problem, no problem.
Oh, you look so distinguished tonight,
Thank
Kevin.
you, thank you.
Wow.
Okay, we all set?
We are all set.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to call this meeting to order at 6:35. Roll call by the town clerk, please.
Kerry McGee,
Here.
Greg LeBoissonier,
Here.
Deb Bacon. Here. Gary Cody,
Here.
Ian Dixon. Here. Nicholas Gorham,
Here.
Ed Wazika.
Present. Okay, if you'd all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance, and Town Sergeant, would you please so kind? Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Town Sergeant, if you would please give the emergency evacuation plan. Okay, next item. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up tonight, for the taxpayers. I also want to thank Auditor General, Mr. Hoyle, for showing up, and fellow state representatives and legislators. Thank you also for showing up. This has been a concern of ours for a while, and I really appreciate that the Auditor General taking his time out to explain this to us with his plan and so on. So with that being said, Mr. Hoyle, please. Okay, hit the button.
Hit the button. Can you hear me now? Okay. Members of the council, good evening, and members of the General Assembly representing Coventry, good evening. As you know, we issued a report on the sewer program in Coventry, and I want to acknowledge that that was at the request of Senator Raptakis and Representative Serpa and others as well. That was more than a year ago, so we've been working on this, not consistently, but certainly intermittently over the last year. So as you know, we released the report at the end of March, early April, and I've prepared a PowerPoint tonight that will go through the highlights of the report. It's not going to cover everything in the report. I'm trying to get the right balance of detail for this evening. So just to highlight the objectives of our review, we wanted to assess the operating challenges of the program that have been, there was a lot of press, obviously, as all of you know, on what was going on with the program. And our intent was really to provide recommendations in the near term to stabilize the program and then develop intermediate and longer term recommendations for town leaders to consider as options to sustain the program going forward. So our intent was to provide an objective view of the status of the program and offer recommendations to address those challenges. So we believe, and we started with this as sort of a core belief, we believe the sewer program is necessary for the town of Coventry to grow economically and to address specific environmental and health and safety issues. So from an overview perspective, obviously the challenge of building the program in Coventry is you're working in an established community and you're trying to build and not do this as new construction is done, but retrofit it in an existing community, which is always more difficult and probably more costly and more challenging. And there's also a disparity in population, which all of you know better than I do, in Coventry from the more densely populated portion of town and the more rural part in the western part of the town as well. So that presents a perspective difference on how different folks, taxpayers will view the program and whether they will ever see a benefit. Those in the western part of the town know that it's unlikely that they will have sewers brought to them, and obviously that affects how they view the program as well. So the fiscal health of the program has a direct impact on the town's finances as well, and this was something we were very concerned. Speak into it a little bit? Okay. Let's see if I can do this here. That's better. So we felt very strongly that the program needed to be stabilized to prevent an unintended consequence on the overall town's fiscal health. And obviously Moody's, as you know, recently had issued 2 advisories on with concern about how the sewer program was affecting the town's overall financial situation. So they did a more current update recently, and they reiterated the same concerns. They said the negative outlook for the town overall reflects our expectations that the town's finances will continue to be pressured by the need to subsidize its sewer operations. Advances have been required from the town's general fund to support the program based on the current cash flow projections, and additional advances will be required in fiscal 2019 and future years, absent changes in billing rates and or operations. Operating deficits are also projected to continue, and we'll get to some of that detail shortly. Sewer rates, we've observed, have not been supported by an appropriate rate-setting process. A viable financial plan does not exist to guide the program and to ensure that amounts borrowed and other operating costs can be supported by sewer fees and connection assessments. Coventry has entered into an intermunicipal agreement with West Warwick Regional Sewer Authority. Obviously, you don't have your own sewer plant, so they do the sewer plant part of the program. So costs paid by Coventry to West Warwick include amounts based on both actual sewer flow, there's 2 components, and a reserve capacity that relates to debt that West Warwick has incurred to operate and build and improve its sewer plant. The reserve capacity percentage currently is in excess of Coventry's actual proportionate usage of the treatment plant, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. The lack of public support for the program and demands that it be suspended result primarily from the high sewer assessments and sewer connection charges for affected homeowners and businesses. A realistic and comprehensive sustainability plan must ensure that sewer program costs are equitably shared and affordable. Ultimately, customer charges in the form of connection assessments or user fees are the source to repay the debt that's been borrowed for the program. And the program is accounted for in a sewer enterprise fund, which is considered to be a self-supporting. It's like a mini business within overall Coventry government operations, so it's intended to break even. It's not any deficit has to be borne by user fees unless it's subsidized by the town. So we had different sections in the report. Our report, by the way, is available on our website. I brought some copies. I think those have all been handed out, but I think it's also on the town's website as well, and it's also on my website, which I'll share the address with you shortly. So we broke down the report into these sections: financial status of the program, intermunicipal agreement with West Warwick, reassess the need for and benefits derived from the sewer program from an economic development, health and safety, and water quality perspective, seek options to reduce the financial impact of sewer assessments on homeowners. I imagine that's of great interest. Sewer rate setting, governance and administration, and then a sort of catch-all recommendation at the end related to regionalizing, or a recommendation to potentially consider regionalizing the West Warwick treatment plant and merging that into a more regional operation rather than each town sort of doing their piece of it. So overall, the report includes 18 recommendations to improve the program. So quickly on the financial status of the program, advances of $2.7 million had been advanced to the town's general fund. Based on current cash flow projections that we did in additional advances are likely. I'm not sure exactly what the status of the advances during fiscal 19. It's important that these advances are reflected as interfund borrowings. These are cash advances from the general fund to the sewer fund. They are not appropriations to the sewer fund. The ability of the sewer fund to repay those advances, though, we feel is unlikely, particularly in the near term. One proposal offered by the town is to offset the advances made from the general fund against amounts owed by the town for sewer assessments. The town itself is also a user of the sewer system for town buildings that are connected to the sewer system. And the town, similar to homeowners and businesses, also finance those sewer assessments over a period of time. So there was a proposal that we think bears consideration that would basically offset those advances against the long-term sewer assessment liability that is owed by the town itself to the sewer fund. So that's something that we think is worthy of some consideration. One of the most critical steps for the town is stabilizing the sewer fund to ensure the timely repayment of debt. Obviously, any lender gets very nervous when there's any threatened thought of not repaying the obligations that the town has borrowed. And basically, I think everyone agrees that you can't really separate the obligations of the sewer fund and say, well, those don't really matter. They're all connected to the town, and folks like Moody's and others will look at it collectively, not separately. So even with the recent debt restructuring, the sewer enterprise fund is projected to require continued cash advances to meet its obligations. The fiscal health of the sewer program cannot be viewed as separate, as I just said. Any threatened or actual default would impact the town's bond rating, future borrowing costs, and could also have an impact on borrowing costs for others in Rhode Island because the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank packages those loans, and if one community were to default, it would affect the overall program as well. So it may be a little bit difficult for you to see from here, but this was a schedule that's in the report. Basically, that line with the yellow arrow highlights the amount of interfund loans that have been required over the previous fiscal years. So as you can see, there was basically insufficient cash flow to meet the operations, the operating costs, the debt service of the program, without cash being advanced from the general fund. And that amount in blue with the yellow arrow is the amount that was required to be advanced in each of those fiscal years to basically provide enough cash so that the bills could be paid for the program. So we did a little modeling and said, what would it look like in the future fiscal years, sort of assuming that nothing changed, and basically to see if the sewer enterprise program would still continue to be in a deficit in 2019, 2020, and 2021. So these are obviously projections that is not, it's not a certainty that those would be the actual results at all. But we made an assumption assuming basically the status quo. There were no extreme changes in operations and sewer rates or anything like that. And that supported that in the next 3 fiscal years, there would continue to be deficits in the sewer enterprise fund absent any changes. So those are the numbers with the, once again, the yellow arrow, and then the numbers themselves are in yellow. They're in parentheses because that is the negative change in net position or the deficit that would likely ensue in each of those years without some change. So this is a schedule that, as you know, Citron Cooperman had been engaged to do a review, and I think they reported last June maybe. So they highlighted that there was a difference between the amount of sewer assessment receivable, basically the long-term amounts that are owed to repay the debt, and the amount of the debt, and there was a difference. So we updated that same analysis. And basically, in the first section there, that's the net difference right now between the amount that's been borrowed and the amount that is receivable or due to be collected over a long-term period for the sewer assessments that have been levied on different homeowners and businesses. So at this point, this was as of June 30, 2018, the amount owed on debt was $7.4 million more than was pledged to be repaid for those assessments. We've updated that in the second half a little bit, knowing that there's some receivables that have not been billed right now for construction that has been done. So there's a little bit of a delay in some of that. So that brings it down to about $5.9 million. So that's better than the number that had been included in the Citron-Cooperman report, but it's still significant, and it's very noteworthy because that's the amount that would have to be recovered from user fees or other sources, basically, to be able to repay that debt over a long time, the duration of the debt. So that's an important number to remember. That's when we talk later about having a sewer rate consultant come in. These are all important numbers that you're going to have to build into your rate setting going forward. So I've included the recommendations sort of after each section of the report. So these are the recommendations we had on this. So, and I realize this first one is a controversial recommendation, but explore if any sewer program costs can or should be supported through the town's general fund. So obviously the sewer enterprise fund is intended to be self-supporting, but there may be a limit to that, particularly if you wanted to balance the impact on any homeowner and the amount of assessments that are levied on them to connect to the system. So we're not recommending specifically that it should, but we are recommending that you take a look at it to see if there is an amount that should be considered, because I think you could argue that some of the benefits of the program maybe don't accrue just to the person that's connected to it. Maybe it solves a health and safety problem. Maybe it facilitates economic development within the town. There's all kinds of additional benefits, and that might be a reason to subsidize it in whole or in part. So the second one we talked about a little bit, that's consider offsetting the town sewer assessment liability for connecting town buildings against the advances that have been made. I think the point there would be if those aren't going to be collected, the negative impact on the town's general fund has already been recognized, but this would allow you to at least obtain, the town would at least obtain some benefit. It's sort of more of an accounting benefit, but it would at least net the two without it just being written off as uncollectible. Sewer assessments, there is some work that has been done that has not been billed as a sewer assessment. So that obviously has a negative cash flow impact because those users are not connected and the assessments aren't complete, and that impacts the cash flow to meet the remaining debt service. There is some remaining unspent bond proceeds that are with the infrastructure bank that have been discussed as using those to pay down some of the amounts that have been borrowed. I think that's pretty much in place to do that over the next few months. That would reduce the amount of debt service required in the near term. And the last recommendation for this section was to enact a minimum base sewer use charge to be applied 1 year after the initial sewer assessment. One of the things that we were somewhat struck by is there were a number of either homeowners or businesses that had entered into a sewer assessment, had begun to pay that, but they had not actually connected to the system. And so there were no user fees coming in for those folks. So we thought it was reasonable to say that 1 year after that, that they would have to connect, and if they haven't connected, then they would have to pay a minimum assessment, because part of this is making sure you have enough customers to support the overall program, and that's been a problem. That would not apply if somebody had sought a waiver or a deferment. So the intermunicipal agreement with West Warwick was a focus. So just to bring everybody up to speed, towns of Coventry and West Warwick have an agreement that outlines how the debt service on the obligation shall be shared. It also talks about the sewer rates and basically is a memorandum of understanding that lays out all the terms of that relationship. So there was a negotiated capacity amount that was built into that agreement. Currently, that's more than the actual proportionate share. I have a schedule that will show you what the detail is in a minute. So that's a debatable point. I think in fairness, it was probably negotiated at a time that there was a good expectation that there was a need for that level of capacity, particularly with Center of New England coming online. For a variety of reasons, that hasn't come along as quickly. So I think currently with that, there's a difference between what the contract says and what the actual flow is, which you'll see in a schedule. So arguably, Coventry sewer customers are somewhat subsidizing other customers of the West Warwick Regional Wastewater Treatment Facility. So this is a schedule. I don't know if you can see it easily, but on the left-hand side is our calculation of the actual capacity. So the important part is the orange piece in the middle there, which for Coventry would be about 12.9% of the total flow, based on actual flow within the, for the facility. But per the negotiated reserve capacity, which is on the right, Coventry is committed to 21.38%. So it's important to make the notation here that there's two ways that West Warwick gets paid. One is based on actual flow, and that's a usage piece that is based on actual flow. The other is the negotiated rate that's applied to debt service. So when West Warwick had to make improvements to its sewer treatment plant, basically that's how the debt service gets allocated to each of the communities. Coventry is paying approximately 21.38% of that debt service, which is in excess, excuse me, of the actual flow that is of about 12.99%. So our recommendation is to revisit the negotiated reserve capacity component of the intermunicipal agreement, renegotiate that component to more closely reflect actual usage. I think it's important, though, to note that one of the things that you might want to consider is important to consider is what is the long-term expected need for that capacity. And that's not an easy thing to predict, but I think you wouldn't want to be too quick to just go down to actual capacity if you think you need more. But it's definitely an area that you should take a look at and see what you think is the best way to approach that. And I think probably getting some outside consulting advice on some of these things would be an appropriate thing. And it's definitely a long-term planning issue that you'd have to consider as well. So one of the things that we felt somewhat strongly about is considering there was very much a divided feeling about the sewer program, excuse me, is that it was important to reassess and sort of revisit the importance of the program and come back to a conclusion that this was a necessary component, that this wasn't something that could be terminated or just that you would not need going forward. Personally, I think it's something that the town needs to have in their toolbox as they go forward because economic development is really dependent upon it. And as with Lake Tioga and other places there with high water tables, there's probably a likely need to have this as a solution should you have a problem there from sewer overflows and things like that. So we thought it was appropriate to implement an information program to educate taxpayers on how the sewer program is integral to the long-term growth and viability of the town. And basically as part of that, increase the number of system users, but strategically by targeting expansion of the system where there is the strongest environmental need, homeowner interest, and a reasonable balance of construction costs to the number of connections and users gained. And basically incorporate that overall planning effort in the town's overall planning efforts. And enhance transparency and communication of any sewer system expansion by requiring notification to affected homeowners at least 2 years in advance. So one of the, obviously, touch points on this whole point was folks that had put in new individual sewage disposal systems and then found later, not too much later, that they were going to have a sewer assessment. And obviously that's a challenging situation to address, to say the least. So these were trying to address, that's a good segue to, we know that the high cost of the assessments for the sewer program are really strong litmus test of how people feel about the program. So we thought it was very important to explore options to manage and reduce that high cost of sewer assessments. So one was taking a look at the components. Since I'm sort of doing a summary here, basically what, to oversimplify a bit, the amount of assessments is the construction cost for bringing the sewer pipe down that street, basically divided among the homeowners that are potentially, or businesses that would potentially connect to that pipe. So we thought it was appropriate to eliminate street paving costs, because their street paving costs, you could argue, would be a necessary town cost regardless of whether there was a sewer there. Police details, and if there was any extraordinary unanticipated construction costs, that those would also be eliminated from the base calculation. So another piece would be to potentially subsidize the sewer assessment by recovering a portion of those costs from either sewer use charges or from a direct subsidy for a portion of the cost from the town's general fund. So this would be sort of taking a little bit more of a relaxed view that all the construction costs for the construction part of the program have to be borne solely from the connectors through the sewer assessments, that as long as you have sufficient revenue, there's a portion of that that could be borne through sewer use charges as well. And this is where I think it's key to get some rate study expertise to help you balance all those different objectives. Reduce the interest rate charged on sewer assessments to approximate the town's actual cost to borrow. I believe there's a bill pending in the General Assembly to better match that with maybe 50 basis points on top of what the town's actual borrowing costs are. Right now, I think they're at 6%, and this would lower it probably somewhere into the 3 to 4% range, which is significant for the homeowner. Increase the availability and awareness of lower cost financing options for homeowners. And then adopt a maximum sewer assessment amount, so that this would be a not to exceed amount. So regardless of how the calculations came out for the actual construction costs on that street, you would adopt an amount that you would never go higher than that, and that piece would then be subsidized through either sewer use charges or other sources. So these are all things that we think should be considered and entertained as part of your overall rate setting process. So this is probably going to be difficult for you to read for those in the audience, but this is a history of the assessment. So I'll just go through it quickly. Beginning in 1997, there was just a flat dollar amount of $3,500 per housing unit. Then it crept up to $4,200, then $6,600 in 2004, $12,900 in 2009. In 2013, the interest rate was dropped from 8% to 6%. And then in 2015, the current mechanism that's in place right now, which is more complicated based on actual construction costs. There's a formula which I won't try to explain right now, but in essence, in an oversimplification, whatever the construction costs are for that particular construction contract, those are the costs that get divided among the potential connectors to that piece of the project. So that has produced a more variable, obviously. Sometimes if construction costs are much higher for that particular project, and that has also been a challenge, obviously, for the town to relay that to homeowners and have some buy-in on that. So on sewer rate setting, so just to point out, there's really two key components here. One is the development of the assessment, which is the connection charge at the initial part, and the other is the usage charge that is part of the annual all the users pay as they go forward. So we think it's important to engage a firm to perform a formal sewer use rate study and to provide expert support to the town in establishing and adopting sewer use rates. So I think it's probably been a while since the town had outside assistance in developing those rates, but we think that's critically important. In fact, I'd probably consider that to be the most important near-term recommendation, is getting some outside assistance to I think I went too far there. Ed, can I go back? I don't, probably not. I apologize for that. So let's see, I might have to go back to my PowerPoint here. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, let's see. There we go. Okay, thank you. So reestablish and commit, the second piece, reestablish and commit to which costs are being recovered through the sewer use fees. So we thought that this was not clearly built into the sewer rate process. Are we trying to cover operations or only some of the cost of building the network? Are we developing rates on a cash flow basis or an accrual accounting basis? How does depreciation factor into that rate setting process as well? So those are all important questions when you're trying to determine and set a rate that is going to produce, not result in a deficit. Establish an appropriate baseline sewer rate that adequately covers all elements of program costs. So I think one of the observations that we've had is because of the way the accounting was done and sort of a commingled cash, it was really not until well after the fiscal year was over that the town had a clear idea of what the results of operations were for the sewer fund. So that, and without a plan going into it and without a budget and not knowing until maybe 6 months after the year is over what the results were, obviously you don't have good information to make decisions. So that really needs to be addressed. You need better information, but you also need a better underpinning of how you're going to try to build those rates as well. So you can, once you have that baseline rate and say, this is what I actually need to have coming in for cash to meet operations and debt service for the year, then you can adjust that baseline rate for this, whatever happens on the reserve capacity and whatever decisions the town wants to make on that. We talked about the shortfalls on the sewer assessments. You're going to have a shortfall there. We predicted it was maybe in the $5.9 million range over a number of years. That's got to be built into the rate, the user rate, to be able to recoup that and make sure that you have sufficient resources to do that. And whether there's any subsidy that could be built in from the general fund or be built into the rate setting process. And then you can also assess and should assess how Coventry's user rates compare to the annual user charge for neighboring communities. And we have a chart on that which we'll show, but I think that's maybe not the most important thing, but you want to know how you compare to other similar communities and know whether you're at the high end or the low end. So we think those are all important considerations to build into the sewer rate setting process. So sewer rates have not been supported by an appropriate rate setting process, which obviously we said. A viable financial plan has not been put in place to guide the program and ensure that the amounts borrowed and other costs can be supported by fees and connection charges. We think the external expertise is needed. Really, the development of the annual sewer rate should be performed in concert with the development of an annual financial plan. So obviously you're doing annual budgeting for your other funds, particularly your general fund and school funds. We think it's important that you have a similar budget process that's approved by the council for your sewer enterprise fund. And that would basically add a lot of discipline to the whole process to make sure that you're anticipating that your revenues from both sewer assessments and from user charges would be adequate to both fund the program and also to repay any debt that you've borrowed for that. So we also observed that the multitude of sewer use rates is unduly complex. We think that supports a move to our final recommendation is to maybe try to regionalize this, which would be a long-term issue. But I won't try to get into it because I probably couldn't do a fair job, but I think it's very complicated because there are businesses in West Greenwich that pay a Coventry rate with a component that's added in from West Warwick, and there's all various varieties of situations depending on where people are located and whether they were grandfathered in or had special deals and all kinds of things that make it quite complex. So we think the external rate setting assistance can clearly help with some of that, because I think one of the things we were concerned about with the complexity of the rate setting and the fact that there aren't a whole lot of people involved, the controls are not probably as tight as one would hope for to make sure that everything's getting billed and recovered. Not to say that we found anything that was amiss, but it's just both the complexity and the systems and the lack of additional folks that are involved make that a challenging process. And we also think additional resources are needed in the finance, rate setting, administrative, and engineering areas to support the program. I think our observation is that this has been done probably a little bit too lean to adequately support the program. So I realize in saying that that only adds to your costs and probably is going to boost the amount that you need to recover from fees to support it. But I'm not sure that it's wise in the long term to try to run it as lean as you have without some of the right resources. So this is just a quick comparison of some of your neighboring communities and others. It might also be difficult for you to see, but the most important thing is you're next in line after West Warwick with the lower rate. So Coventry, for an average, we tried to do this for an average single-family, three-bedroom home, $316 for Coventry, which is a composite of the sewer use fee and the West Warwick user fee and other charges. West Warwick is at $277. Barrington is at a high of $533. Some communities have a flat rate, like Cranston. Theirs is $458. It's not based on usage. It's sort of a flat fee. So there's all variations on the theme of how different communities are billing and recovering their fees. I think it's also challenging to compare, say, a Cranston, which has probably the vast majority of its homeowners in sewered areas, and they've been sewered for a long time. It's hard to make some of those comparisons to what you're trying to do in Coventry, where you're really just building a system now. But that gives you, I think, if you put a positive spin on it, it shows that your rate right now is not excessive, so it shows there's a little bit of capacity there to increase those fees without being an outlier compared to other communities. So as I probably said too many times, we think this is important to get some expertise to help you basically manage those rates and find the optimal mix of sewer assessments and user fees that allow you to be self-supporting, but also build in a component so that in the future you're able to repay debt service for things you've obligated to. So on the governance administration, we had these recommendations. We talked about the annual operating plan, which we think is critically important. We think that should be formally adopted by the council. Evaluate the need for additional finance and administrative staff. Utilize the separate bank account. So this is maybe a little bit deeper in the weeds, but the reason this is important, there is a bank account that is tied. It has largely been inactive because there's been using the pooled cash of the town overall. The reason this is important is when you're not using the separate bank account, it was not clear how much of the subsidy was needed to go to the sewer enterprise fund to pay the bills of that. That didn't become apparent until the books were closed and the audit was complete, and then it became clear how much of an advance had been required for the year to support the program. I would argue that knowing that a lot sooner would give you as much better information to know how much you're subsidizing those operations on a cash flow basis. So I think by using the bank account is probably administratively a little more challenging because you have to make sure there's enough money in the bank account at all times, but I think that's going to give you a clearer picture as to how you're doing at real-time information. We think the town should consider acquiring an enhanced computer application to facilitate tracking and billing of sewer assessments. As we mentioned before, pretty complicated. It's not everybody gets charged the same rate. There's all kinds of rate variations. I think given what you have, I think the town does a pretty good job with it, but I think it probably could be made easier with the right software. So I realize that with recommending some of these things, there's always a cost that goes with them, but but I think there's a balance to take a look at that and see if some automation and some increased software could help you manage this a little bit better. And that relates to the control issue, which I alluded to before. Really, I think there's one person that's doing most of this. It's pretty complex, and adding in a little bit of computer expertise and sophistication there would probably help with the control aspect as well. So we felt too, as we were looking at this, and I freely acknowledge that this is a long-term recommendation, but I think when we were looking at it, and we've talked with the folks in West Warwick and tried to look at it as well, and said maybe long-term, the best solution here would be to find some way to operate this on a truly regional basis, not unlike the way Narragansett Bay is operated or the Kent County Water Authority, so that you wouldn't be trying to replicate some of these billing functions within in-house and things like that. So that's really a long-term thing. That's not a long, it probably might be 5 years out, or could be longer. And obviously you'd have to have some buy-in from other folks as well that would be interested in doing that. But we think it's a worthy item to consider. It's also very consistent with the shared services model. As you know, many have talked about how can municipalities keep with the tax cap that's in place, how can you keep doing all these things? Well, one of the solutions that people are passionate about is saying, well, the towns nearly need to get together and try to do some of these things collaboratively rather than trying to do them individually. So it really fits within that same model. So our recommendation on that is to create a study group to explore and assess the feasibility of fully regionalizing the West Warwick Regional Waste, it doesn't flow off the tongue, sorry. West Warwick Regional Wastewater Treatment Facility, including representation from all municipalities using the treatment plant. And I believe Coventry does have representation on the board, but this would be more, probably a more formal representation. So we think that's something that's worthy of consideration. Here's my contact information. If anybody's interested in the report, as I mentioned, it is on the Coventry website. It's also on my website at oag.ri.gov. And my email address is there if anybody had any questions, or my phone number. I'd be more than happy to hear from you. So I don't know how I did as far as whether that was too fast or not, but I'd be happy to entertain any questions from members of the council or General Assembly representatives as well.
Thank you very much for that explanation and the PowerPoint. At this time, I would like to open up to questions from anybody from the council first. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, Councilman Cody.
Hi, Mr. Hoyle. Thank you for coming. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Gary Cody, Representative District 4. I'm going to ask for a little conjecture and opinion here. What is the advantage to West Warwick Regional Sewer Treatment Facility to sit down and renegotiate with Coventry? We've had a long-time outstanding contract with them that calls for a certain amount and a certain number that they're certain of at this point. They know what they're getting from the town of Coventry, and we're not even close to using the flow that we pay for. We also cover that portion of maintenance updates that come in and are required by the EPA, by DEM. So you're absolutely right in your opinion that we are subsidizing the West Warwick Sewer Treatment Plant by paying for flow that we're not even using. So the taxpayers in the town of Coventry are subsidizing that. What is the advantage to West Warwick? Because they're not going to come in and renegotiate with us because they're nice people, and although they are nice people, but why would they want to hurt themselves financially to make it better for somebody else who's paying a portion of the maintenance and upkeep and paying for flow that they're not having to treat, that's not being used? Why would they come back to the table with us? And I know it's just opinion.
That, I don't have a really good answer to it, but I mean, like all negotiations, I think, maybe it's a staggered, maybe it's coming at a reduced rate now with a ramp up at some point, maybe to address some of the challenges that Coventry has in the near term. And as I said, I think it's important to take a look long term with the center of New England and see what that capacity need really is, and sort of have like a 2, 5, 10-year outlook for where you think you're going to be, which is not easy to do, but I think that would be something that you would want to do maybe before you even sit down with them and have that conversation.
Thank you. And again, in your opinion, what is the importance of a sanitary sewer system in the town of Coventry when it comes to future development and future sources of revenue, bringing new businesses in, development of land to bring new taxes in, new revenue through that stream? How important do you think it is to the town of Coventry to continue forward with this if we can do it on a financially stable basis?
I don't know if can you hear me now? Okay. I think it's critically important because I think future development is probably largely dependent on having that as an option. So obviously I'm not an engineer and nor am I a environmentalist, but I think it's largely, I don't think you could have done the Center of New England project without having access to that, and obviously that's still in a stage of development with expectations for significant ramp up. So
I don't know how to phrase this exactly, so I'm just gonna, in my opinion, the cost of a sanitary sewer program that's going to benefit every taxpayer that lives in the town, whether they're hooked up to the sewer system or not, through redevelopment, through new development, and to help stabilize the tax base, the cost of that sanitary sewer program should be spread equally throughout the town of Coventry by all of the taxpayers, not just the people who are connected to that sewer line. Is that reasonable to feel? Is that reasonable for me to think that? I mean, is the sewer program that important to the town of Coventry to continue to move forward, that it should be, the cost of that should be borne by all of the taxpayers and not just the people that are either fortunate or unfortunate enough to live on the new sewer line, depending on their economic stand within their own household? Is it that important that it should be spread townwide?
well, I think that's the underpinning of one of our recommendations. I don't think it's for me to make that decision. I think it's appropriate for the council, but I think that's a valid thought process that the council should consider as to when you get into, should there be some kind of a subsidy for exactly that point to maybe reduce the impact of sewer assessments on homeowners, because to subsidize it a bit because it's not all on them for the cost. So I think it's certainly a fair point to debate and consider as to what the right mix of supporting the program through sewer assessments, user charges, and potentially some kind of a subsidy from other sources. I think it's a fair point to certainly consider.
And finally, my last question. It was addressed in your report, in your overview of your report, in your PowerPoint. Would it be, in your opinion, I know that the interest rate that the town of Coventry currently charges on sewer assessments is ridiculous, to say the least, ridiculous. Is it unreasonable to think that the town of Coventry is entitled to 1/4 or 0.5% interest above what they pay for administering those 20-year, at this point, 20-year sewer assessments if the taxpayer decides to finance that through the town of Coventry? That means our employees are handling all of that and administering that loan. Is it unreasonable or unfair to think that the town is entitled to 1/4 or 0.5% above what they borrow the money at to administer those loans?
Is this on? Okay. I think that's yet another source of revenue, though, to support the program, and it goes to my point of trying to balance all those sources. So with the reduction of the interest rate, say from the current 6 to say something more like 4, obviously that's a loss of revenue into the program right now. I think it's appropriate to give the homeowners more, make it a fair interest charge to them, but then that revenue that's lost has to be made up somewhere else. So then it goes into the sewer use fee, but that's why I think it's really important to have a good understanding of how all those different revenue sources are determined and built, and make sure that the overall plan from all the various sources supports the program overall. So it's really, if you take X amount, and our report details what the expected loss would be as you in a 2% reduction in the rate, that revenue needs to be built into another component. But clearly, with the long-term borrowing nature of the sewer assessments for the homeowners, it's a lot fairer to them to have a lower interest rate, just like it would be on your home mortgage or anything like that. It's obviously has a very beneficial impact for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time again, Mr. President. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cody. I just want to reiterate something Mr. Cody said. Mr. Solicitor, maybe you could help me on that. We do have the legal right to renegotiate with West Warwick. Was that written in the original agreement that at any particular time down the road we could sit down and negotiate the contract? Am I right in saying that, or am I not?
Yes, we can renegotiate the contract anytime we want, because ultimately we have the right to terminate the contract. The only drawback to terminating the contract is that we lose all of our future capacity. We keep what we have, but we give up all future capacity. But right now, yes, we can do that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Does anybody else from the council have any comments, any questions? Yes, absolutely. Please. Yeah, it's on.
Well, thank you so much for your thorough review and analysis, which backed up your recommendations. It was easy reading, long but easy reading. I have high-level comments, not so much questions, as I've read many documents prior to this report, and this report did expand my information, so thank you again. I think it's very important that the council takes a vote to reaffirm the importance of the sewer program. Right now, it's a moratorium, and I think we need to put a stake in the ground and vote as to whether we believe that we need to continue with the sewer program or not. And I think that's step number one. That way, it's very clear where we're going and what the path is. Secondly, once we do that, I do think that we need to align our long-awaited comprehensive plan with the sewer program and see how it all dovetails in and how it works together. We need to get a plan. You mentioned that many, many times in the report. We need a plan. We need to call in expertise when we need it, such as a sewer rate study. We absolutely need an enterprise sewer budget, which we've talked about, but we haven't seen a budget. I know there have been some financial reports, but we do not have a budget. We need a budget. We need to have a clear direction in which we want to go. And I do support the idea that we need the financial expertise and software that will allow us to do accurate reporting and analysis, and also to ensure that all residents, there's equity for all residents. And finally, I do believe that we need policies and ordinances to support the decision-making, and especially the decision that we want to go forward with a sewer program. I support going forward. I do not know how the rest of the council people feel, but I think it's important that that's step number one, to take the vote. And I'm not suggesting it be this evening, but we need to do it very soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman. Does anybody else from the council have any questions? We'll open this up to any state legislators that have any questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Councilman. Auditor General Hoyle, thank you again for coming here to Coventry and sharing us your findings for the past year. And I know Representative Serpa cannot be with us. She's at the hospital visiting her husband, or else she would have been here. She was the other half of our initiative to try to get answers, and hopefully we can make this a very affordable program. Because when you ask the citizen out there, do they want sewers, their answer would be yes if it was affordable. And then right now, I know on one of your graphics, you have on page 16, the average cost is about $20,000. But when you add the other costs of tie-ins, it's probably around $30,000. And that cost is probably prohibitive, and that's why we had an outcry for the last year of residents getting these bills and sticker shock. How do they afford them? We had senior citizens in their 80s that are approximately going to get this high bill. So basically, I think that we have to take the steps in order for this program to move forward is to make it as cost effective and to also help a lot of the elderly, a lot of the low-income families that we do have in certain sections of the town that probably cannot afford this sewer program. I'm going to ask you a couple questions and pass it on to my colleagues. On page 12 of your outline here, I know you showed that Coventry was only using 11.5%, but yet they're being negotiated 21%. How much difference is that in dollars? How much is Coventry paying more every year to West Warwick? Do we have a figure of that? Is it in the hundreds of thousands of dollars or close to $1 million?
Piece is applied to the debt service component. I think the debt service is probably in the 600,000 range.
Approximately 670,000 this year on, to West Warwick plant, cost to West Warwick.
I can get back to you with the
Right.
impact.
Because I think that figure is very important. It shows how much more Coventry is paying in excess that they should not be paying. And you also brought up the fact that we should have a fiscal stability plan in place to move forward, which is, again, very important.
Yes.
And also, as far as the two components, I know we have one bill, Senator Gordon and I have sponsored Senate Bill 201, which it doesn't use a percentage like 4%. It's whatever the money was borrowed, it could be 3%, that the town should not charge more than that percentage rate that is being offered by a fiscal institution. Plus, again, it's debatable. I know the amendment of this bill would say may charge up to 0.5%. So again, it's going to be the actual amount that it's going to cost as far as administrative costs. And it is a big difference, and I think that savings, I'm not sure, it could be running right around maybe $5,000 to $8,000 a year if that interest rate was the real interest rate that is being charged by a financial institution. So that's a huge component. And the second part of that component is also the paving. Do you know what those figures? I've heard anywhere between 30% of the actual sewer bill. So if you take a sewer bill and you can mandate these two components right here, you can bring the sewer cost probably down by at least 50%, maybe. But I think that's the right direction, because I don't think anybody out here wants to see a sewer bill that high, because we're not going to be able to afford it. And unless we try to address a lot of these issues that you have here, they have to be addressed, or else this program cannot move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Vatakis. We are actually planning we're waiting until after the budget for bringing the interest rates down. That's been talked about a while, but I think the town manager has a couple of comments he might want to say.
As far as the cost on the paving, the cost on Hazard Street, which was $300 and some thousand on that project, that shortened project, the cost of the paving was about $32,000 in that particular case. It's not typically 30 or 40% of the cost of the whole project. The main part of the cost is always in the installation of the piping and everything. The asphalt on top is a much smaller percentage than that. So if you figured normally 8 to 10%, sometimes even less than that on the overall cost. And that is something we're looking at doing, is removing that from the assessment cost when we calculate the assessments. So that is being looked at and being removed on upcoming ones that come forward at this point.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Manager. Ms. Cody, you have something?
Senator, just for a point of clarification, please. In your statement, you said how much Coventry is paying to West Warwick that we shouldn't be paying for the flow that we're not using. That's not entirely true. What Coventry is paying to West Warwick is exactly what's called for in the contract that a previous council negotiated with the town of West Warwick. We're not appropriating money to the town of West Warwick at this point to pay for things that we're not contractually obligated to pay by a contract that was negotiated by a previous council. So it's not like we're paying them extra out of the kindness of our heart. And I understand the number you're looking for, and I completely agree, we need that number. But your statement made it sound like we're paying West Warwick for things that are not contractually obligated, that we're not contractually obligated to pay. And I just wanted to make clear that what we're paying them is exactly what the contract is that was negotiated by a previous council when that agreement was entered into. If we can renegotiate and lower that number, this council is absolutely on board with doing that. But for the time being, as long as we're contractually obligated to pay that number, that's the number we have to pay if we want to keep any usage with the West Warwick Sewer Treatment Plant at all.
Correct, and that's our obligation, so I think that's very important. What the town solicitor said is maybe we should seriously put a lot of weight in trying to renegotiate that contract, because again, this is money that's being thrown out.
Agreed 100% that needs to be renegotiated.
Okay, that being said, are there any other state legislators have any comments, any questions?
So, I would just like to ask the council, do you plan to adhere to the majority or all of, or the suggestions made in this report? Or is there anything you think that might prevent you from being able to do that?
We're absolutely going to look into every suggestion. We already currently are working on some of the suggestions that have already been made. It's a slow process. This is not going to happen overnight. I mean, it takes a while. But we absolutely are going to look into every suggestion he has and make sure it works for the town of Coventry.
Okay, that's very encouraging. So, like the other reps here, and like you all, we do want to keep the costs down. So if there's anything that you guys need, please, I'd really appreciate it if you just let us know. Because we just, the main thing is just so that we get everything paid and we don't hurt the taxpayers, that's all, so.
Well, I appreciate that, and we absolutely want to, we want to do that, and I appreciate you trying to help us out, and yes, and
Thank you.
so we will definitely work together. We need to work together to make this work. I mean, but it is not an overnight fix. We know that. We've been dealing with this problem for several years, and it's been ongoing for quite a few years. It's not something that's happened over the last few. It's been ongoing for a while. So we are determined to solve this problem, and I think we are heading in the right direction. Our town manager has been working diligently to try to come up with some ideas. We've been utilizing the report from the Auditor General, so we are heading in the right direction. But thank you very much for that offer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, Mr. Cody, I have one more thing to say real quick.
Representative Roberts, thank you for that offer. I just want you to know that myself and Vice President LeBossinier are liaisons from the council to the sewer subcommittee, and we attend all their meetings. And we are currently going over this report with the sewer subcommittee, all the recommendations made by the Auditor General's office, and we are currently getting ready to start the process of rewriting all of our sewer ordinances for the town of Coventry to bring those into conjunction with what the report from the Auditor General says, and we're going to start working on that at our next meeting now that this report has been reviewed in person by the Auditor General. So Thursday night, when we have our next sewer subcommittee meeting, we're going to start bringing that to fruition and absolutely taking this report from the Auditor General into account when we start setting those new regulations for the sewer project in the town of Coventry.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cody. Mr. LeBossinier, you have some comment.
Yes, one of the bright spots that we talked about with the Center of New England, and this council and previous councils have worked diligently for years now, trying to come to agreement with the to get the center with the receiver. And we've changed that agreement so many times, back and forth. Well, the bright spot and the point going forward right now is that the judge has approved the agreement between the receiver and the town of Coventry, which is virtually about to open up that logjam, which is certainly going to help us derive additional funding and growth at the center of New England. We have worked so hard trying to get that agreement done, and years later, here we are. It finally happened. And so now we're looking good going forward, and that will be in all of our discussions as well, too, to determine the exact amounts of dollars which will be infused into the sewer fund.
I might add, I spoke to the Auditor General earlier. This condition, this problem, the situation we have can be fixed. It absolutely can work. We can make this work. It's not going to be the end of the sewer program and not be, financially going to be, put us in any worse condition. This can be fixed with working hard and trying to get, a reasonable solution for both the taxpayers and the town. So we are working towards that. Anybody else from the state have, yes, Senator Rogers.
How you doing? I went through this report earlier when it first came out, and I think you come up with a lot of points that'll work out. It gives the ability to have multiple areas, which I think at the end of the day, the town of Coventry, you've got a lot of different areas where you got to fix the problem. You got to get a balance sheet, and it gives you so many different areas to assess what percentage of that should be shifted to and be responsible for at the end of the day. And hopefully, it's going to take a lot of work because you have so many components to go to. You got renegotiating your overflow usage that from less work, which may be tough because it seems like you're a little off leverage on that one. I don't know how you're going to work that one, but I mean, that's a reality of the fact. As your Moody's drop, your rating drops, that affects the entire town's tax base of borrowing, which affects every taxpayer, costs them more to borrow money. So the whole town has a little bit of skin in the game. You have to take that into effect. You have growth with the sewer line coming in that'll benefit the entire town. So you've got a tough balance, what you're going to have to figure out how much of it as a town benefits has to put forth, what the sewer line goes up where it went, how much they have to put in. Of course, they have more benefit than the rest of the town, but how you're going to cut that pie up is going to be tough because it's not going to be good answers for anybody all along. At the end of the day, you owe so much and it has to be sliced out, and you got your work cut out for you. So if I can help you in any way, I'd be more than happy to.
Thank you for that. Any other state legislator that has a comment?
A couple more questions. Director Hoyle, the other issue is, did we look at, during your report, I know this is just the outline, but in your original report, did we look at the properties that were given a unfair abatement, meaning there was some, I'm not sure if you looked at some of the properties like maybe Harris Mills and Anthony Mills where supposedly the numbers were supposed to be extremely high, and yet they ended up paying a very low number for their sewer assessment. Did you look at individual properties at all to make a comparison what should have been paid and what was not paid?
So we did, we're aware, I think there was about $2.8 million worth of abatements over a period of time. Don't hold me to the exact time period, but we were aware of those. We didn't spend a tremendous amount of time looking at those individual abatements, and we sort of were focused more on going forward, realizing that those were done and there wasn't probably that much that could be done on that.
Because again, legally, I'm not a legal scholar, but I don't know how it would hold up in court if the town went back to those properties and said, look, we've got a serious issue here that it's costing a lot of the ratepayers and even the taxpayers, it's going to be costing them a lot of money in the future, but those properties individually should have been paying their fair share. We talk about fair share all the time, that everyone should be paying their fair share. So I'm not sure legally if we can go back and look at those properties that got away with a very low assessment. And another part of my question was also that we should not be also, I think in your report you looked at the collateralization of buildings. I know in this building right here that there was $1.2 million that was used. So that should stop here on in the future, that buildings should not be town buildings should not be collateralized for sewer revenue.
We did make that point, and I think to be fair, there were reasons why that was done, but we recommended that not continue, obviously, without bond counsel weighing in on that, and there'd be more due diligence on the validity of whether that should be done. But we did comment on that in the report. To your other comment about the, excuse me, abatements, our understanding, we didn't look at them, but our understanding was a lot of those were complex legal situations. Obviously, I'm not an attorney, but we did touch on it enough to just know that they were not simple, issues, and there were probably underpinnings of legal things of why some of those abatements occurred. Not saying that doesn't mean they're not worthy of being looked at, but they were complicated situations.
Can I just make a comment on that? That statement is very misleading, Senator Reptakis. You're leading people to believe that these abatements were made illegally. The full assessments were done on Harris Mill. There was betterment clauses. There's a lot of reasons why assessments were done to pay for the price to install a sewer line. When the sewer line was already done, there was different arrangements were made for assessments. It's very misleading to think that we abated, like I said, Harris Mill paid full assessments. Anthony Mill had a betterment clause that was in the contract. They already had a sewer line. So to just make people think that we didn't charge assessments to certain people and some we did, it's very misleading.
But, Mr. President, that's why we're in this problem. I think historically, if you start piling up all these mistakes, this is what you have today. You have a lot of deficits.
That was not a mistake. That was not a mistake.
Well, whatever the case might be, it shows right now. We wouldn't be here because we are in a deficit. We gotta try to brighten up this sewer program to make it viable to continue. And I just don't want to continue this program if we're gonna be handing out $30,000 bills or $35,000 bills. So there were mistakes made, maybe, maybe not. But the evidence is clear. It's here. We're here. If it wasn't for a program that was not facilitated perfectly, we would not be here. So we've got a lot of work to do. Hopefully we're going to work together to evaluate the problems and hopefully make this program move forward that's going to be acceptable to the ratepayer and the taxpayer of this town.
I'm going to, Mr. President, if I may. Senator, I'm going to address it, and I'm going to address it for the last time, because this has been a big question and a big point of contention since the beginning of all of this. When those two mills came online for redevelopment, there was a no betterment clause in our sewer ordinances that clearly said that if the sewer assessment had already been paid on those properties, the sewer authority in the town of Coventry had no right to go back and change the assessment for the betterment or financial improvement of the town of Coventry. Both of those mills had already paid the sewer assessment on those properties before they were sold for redevelopment. So the town of Coventry did not go back and reassess new sewer assessments on those properties because they were already paid, and our sewer ordinance clearly said there was a no betterment clause. So we were not going to violate our own ordinance by going back and increasing sewer assessments on those properties. The second part of that is, I don't want anybody to sit here and think tonight that those two redevelopment projects weren't good for the town of Coventry. Before it was redeveloped, we were collecting commercial property tax on $860,000 of total value on the Anthony Mill. Upon redevelopment, and when it came online at full tax credit, we are collecting commercial property taxes on $15+ million. That was a great investment for the town of Coventry. Harris Mill was just as good. Thank you.
Thank you for making that point. Like I said, to bring up what happens in the past, we need to move forward. We really do need to move forward, but I just wanted to make sure that the taxpayers were not misled on that. Are there any other comments from anybody from the state legislation? Town council? Or the general, we really appreciate, if the public has any comments, please address them to the council members or to your state legislation, and at a later date, rather than to keep the Auditor General here all night. Any questions, we'll address them at a later time. You can also send any questions in to the town manager, and we'll do our best to answer any questions after you review the report. So once again, I thank you very much for your time, and if there's no other questions, a motion to adjourn. So moved. We have a motion, we have a second?
I second it.
We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Ayes have it. Thank you very much.